Welcome to Session 3 of a Bible overview called A Nation is Born. At the end of our last session, God gave Abraham and Sarah a son, Isaac, in their old age. God would use Isaac to start a new nation. Through this nation would come the promised Redeemer. This nation will be Israel, and the people are called by various names: Jews, Israelites, or Hebrews. The story of Isaac covers many chapters of Scripture, so we will cover just the key points of Israel's history. As I summarize the story, notice the themes of relationships and human heart. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have twin sons, Esau and Jacob. At their birth, there is a prophecy that the older son, Esau, will serve the younger son, Jacob. Thus, Jacob is the son through whom the line of promise will come. They have family problems due to favoritism. Esau, as the eldest, was entitled to the birthright, which meant he would receive a double portion of the family inheritance along with becoming the family's leader. But Esau shows disregard for this and, through lack of self-control, sells his birthright to Jacob. In order to secure the birthright, Jacob needs the legal blessing from his father Isaac. To get this, Jacob's mother plans a clever way for Jacob to deceive his father into thinking he is giving the blessing to Esau, but he is really going to give it to Jacob. Jacob then proceeds to carry off this deception. When Esau finds out Jacob has secured the birthright, he threatens to kill Jacob, and Jacob runs for his life. During one of his lonely nights on the run, he wrestles with God, and God changes his name to Israel. He travels to the home of his mother's brother Laban, who lives back in Haran. Jacob then falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. He wants to marry her and works 7 years to earn the privilege to do so, but Laban deceives Jacob so that he ends up marrying the older sister, Leah, instead. Eventually, Jacob does also marry Rachel, but there is jealousy between the sisters. In the end, Jacob has children not only through Leah and Rachel, but also through Rachel and Leah's servants. He has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. From the son Levi will come the future line of priests. From the son Judah will come the line of promise. Joseph is another significant son, although he is not in the line of promise. His story is so important that it takes up chapters 37 through 50 in Genesis. I will just give you the key points of Joseph's life that help us follow biblical history. First, because Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, his brothers are jealous of him. You may have heard the famous story of Jacob giving Joseph the coat of many colors and the resulting jealousy of the 10 older brothers. In the end, the brothers sell Joseph to an Egyptian as a slave and then lie to their father, Jacob, deceiving him into thinking that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. The brothers assume Joseph will die as a slave in Egypt. Second, Joseph does have many trials in Egypt and is unfairly imprisoned. While in prison, he earns a reputation interpreting dreams. Eventually, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, has terrible dreams no one can interpret. Finally, Joseph is called before Pharaoh to see if he can interpret the troubling dreams. Joseph is able to do so with God's help. The dreams mean a famine is coming in 7 years and will then last 7 years. The dreams and their prophecies and later fulfillment display the sovereignty of God. So it is that Pharaoh seeks Joseph's counsel regarding the coming drastic famine. Joseph recommends grain be grown in the 7 good years ahead and stored for use in the following 7 years of famine. God's work through Pharaoh results in 3 important outcomes. First, Pharaoh recognizes that the God of Joseph has given him the interpretation to his dreams and declares Joseph second in command in Egypt. Second, since a famine happens in other countries too, Joseph's family is starving back in Canaan, and this motivates them to come to Egypt for grain. Third, Joseph reveals to his brothers who he is, and they fear revenge. But we see what Joseph's heart was like in his response in Genesis 50:20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph understands that he was taken to Egypt in the sovereignty of God. Thus his family is reunited, and Pharaoh invites them to move to Egypt. He even gives them the good land of Goshen to live in. Only 70 Hebrews, also called Jews or Israelites, exist in the world at this time, and they are living in Egypt. The date is around 1526 BC. Let's now start in Exodus, reading chapter 1:5 through chapter 2:10. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Remember, the slavery of the Israelites was prophesied to Abraham in Genesis 15:13 and 14. And this is called a fulfilled prophecy. It shows that God is sovereign as he knows the future. And in the sovereignty of God, Moses' life was spared. During his early childhood, he lives with his own mother, who probably taught him about God. But after that, he was raised in the court of Pharaoh and educated as an Egyptian. The story continues in verses 11 to 17. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. Moses was 40 when he left Egypt. He marries one of the daughters he met at the well, has 2 sons, and is a shepherd for 40 years. Now in Exodus 2:23-25 we read, "During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." The story continues with an amazing event when Moses is 80 years old. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." I want to emphasize a few important points. First, in verse 6, God refers to the line of promise when he tells Moses who he is when he says, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." This verse is quoted in the New Testament by Jesus when he says in Matthew 22:31 and 32, "But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living." Second, it is important to know God's name, which he gives to Moses in verse 14. God says it is, "I am who I am." It means he is the unchanging, eternal, creator God who keeps his covenant. Third, note in the first part of verse 15 that God again refers to the line of promise when he says, God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." We see here the theme to remember God. Lastly, God in his sovereignty gives a prophecy to Moses in verse 12 when he says, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." And this mountain is Mount Sinai, and this prophecy will be fulfilled, as we will see. After many protests, Moses asks if someone could go with him, and God tells him that his brother Aaron can go along. Then we see our theme of obedience when Moses goes to Egypt. So he and Aaron went to the Pharaoh and told him that God wanted him to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh would not let them go, for he did not fear their God. Moses came many times to ask him. Pharaoh became infuriated and increased the workload on the slaves. Then the people were angry at Moses because their work had become more difficult. But God told Moses to remind the people that he, God, would lead them out. Let's read Exodus 7, 6-13. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a miracle,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. In order to convince Pharaoh to fear God, God sent plagues on the Egyptians as judgment. God's sovereignty is seen in causing 9 plagues to occur in a year's time, and God even let Pharaoh know when each plague would start and end. But the Bible tells us Pharaoh's heart was continually stubborn, and he wouldn't listen or let the people go. Now let's read Exodus 11, 1-3. Now the Lord has said to Moses, "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold." The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. Then God sent the 10th and final plague. Pharaoh was warned that this plague would be the angel of death who would come over Egypt and kill all the firstborn sons, including Pharaoh's son. But again, Pharaoh wouldn't listen. In order for the Israelites not to lose their firstborn sons at this time, God gave special instructions to Moses so that the angel of death would pass over the Jewish homes. This would become known as the Passover. Let's look at those special instructions in Exodus 12, 1-13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So, in order to avoid death, the Israelites had to have faith and obey what God told them to do. From this point on, the Israelites understood that to be spared from death, an innocent life had to be sacrificed for them, that blood had to be shed in their place. Then God told them to gather in their homes with the blood on the doorposts and eat a meal which consisted of foods prepared in a certain way. All this had great significance, and obedience was an act of faith. God commanded that this special meal was to be done every year so that the people would always remember how the Lord had delivered the Hebrews from Egypt. We'll learn when we get to the New Testament that Jesus Christ is called Lamb of God, Christ our Passover Lamb, and spotless Lamb of God. Thus, the entire celebration becomes symbolic of the coming Redeemer. Let's continue to read in Exodus 12:28-32. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all of his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." We learned before that when God prophesied to Abraham about the Jews becoming slaves, he also said they would leave slavery with great wealth. Let's see how that prophecy is fulfilled in Exodus 12:33-36. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. After the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind, and he and his army chased them. The people cried out to Moses in fear. Let's read Exodus 14:15-28. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. So we end this session with the Israelites miraculously freed from their slavery in Egypt. Throughout this story, we've seen the themes of the sovereignty of God, human heart, judgment, and grace in God giving them freedom. To this day, the Jews annually celebrate the Passover to carry out the theme of remembering how the Lord led them out of Egypt. In Session 4, we'll learn how the Israelites survived and became a nation living in the Promised Land.